The moment we stepped inside Cravenwood Sanitarium, the air turned cold, heavier than the forest outside. My breath condensed in front of me, though it wasn't nearly cold enough for that. The air smelled metallic, a mix of rust and damp earth. Each step echoed down the endless hallways, bouncing back, distorted, as if the walls themselves were alive, bending sound to their will. I gripped my flashlight tightly. The beam cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating fragments of a world long abandoned. Scattered patient records, overturned gurneys, and graffiti scrawled in languages I didn't recognize. My pulse hammered in my ears as I led the group deeper into the decaying structure. The others trailed behind me. Ethan, the self-proclaimed leader. Claire, documenting everything with her camera. Marcus, visibly skeptical but determined to prove his bravery. Sarah, unusually quiet, clutching a journal she'd found near the entrance. And the further we ventured, the more wrong the place felt. Shadows seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, flickering just outside the reach of my flashlight. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination, the product of too many horror stories and not enough sleep. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, distant but distinct. It carried my name. I froze mid-step, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. I turned sharply, but no one was there. Behind me, Claire bumped into my shoulder, her sharp inhale signaling she'd heard it too. Neither of us said anything. We didn't have to. In one of the side rooms, Sarah called us over. Ernst, she. Her voice was shaky, almost drowned out by the sound of wind that somehow slithered through the stagnant air. She held up the journal she'd been clutching. The yellowed pages, brittle with age, detailed experiments by Dr. Elias Craven, a name etched into the very walls of the sanitarium. His obsession, severing the link between the soul and the body. The body. I flipped through the pages as the group crowded around me. Diagrams of human figures, dissected down to their very essence, filled the pages. But it was the final entry that made my blood run cold. The ink bled into the parchment as though it had been scrawled in haste or desperation. They've opened the gate. The veil is thinning. We are not alone. Before anyone could react, a crash echoed from the end of the hall. A gurney tipped over, its wheels spinning aimlessly. The sound ricocheted through the corridors, chasing away the silence, but leaving something darker in its wake. We instinctively backed into the room, the journal still in my hands as the light above us flickered erratically. That was when we saw it, etched into the floor beneath the scattered debris, symbols arranged in a chaotic, spiraling pattern. They pulsed faintly, their glow like dying embers. Tyler moved closer, his equipment crackling with static. The symbols seemed to react to him, flaring up brighter with each step. His face paled, his lips trembling as he stammered something none of us could hear over the building's groan. A deafening bang shattered the air as the room's door slammed shut, locking us inside. The whispers returned, louder now, weaving through the walls and wrapping around us like unseen vines. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to stay lit, and then the shadows began to shift again, not just at the edges of my vision this time, but right in front of us. They moved with intention, pooling together until they formed a human-like shape. Hollow eyes stared back at me, blacker than the surrounding darkness, voids that seemed to pull light into their depths. It opened its mouth, not to speak, but to release a soundless scream. I felt it more than I heard it, a pressure that squeezed my chest and filled my head with static. The room quaked as objects flew from shelves, and the symbols on the floor burned brighter. I couldn't move. None of us could. And then, just as suddenly, the shadow dissipated, leaving behind a single word burned into the wall. Veil. Ethan grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed closer now, the ceiling lower. The room itself was shrinking, suffocating us. The whispers intensified, overlapping into a cacophony. My heart raced as I turned toward Sarah. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. Her eyes were locked on something I couldn't see, something behind me. The last thing I felt before the lights went out completely was icy fingers grazing the back of my neck. The darkness swallowed us whole. My breath felt trapped in my chest, as if the room itself was choking me. The whispers didn't stop when the light went out. They grew louder, more insistent, now laced with something far worse. Laughter. Not human laughter, but a guttural, rasping sound that coiled around my brain and squeezed until I felt my vision blur. It was everywhere and nowhere, all at once. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. When the beam finally flickered on, it illuminated faces that didn't belong to my friends. Gaunt, pale figures crowded the edges of the room, their eyes nothing but sunken pits. They didn't move, just stared, their mouths stretched into grotesque, too-wide grins. The others screamed. At least I think they did. I couldn't hear them over the thunderous pounding of my heart. My flashlight sputtered, the beam jerking violently between those hollow faces and the spiraling symbols on the floor. The glowing markings pulsed now, faster, almost in rhythm with my racing pulse. Ethan shoved the door again, using his entire body weight, but it was like the frame had fused shut. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick with a smell I couldn't place. It was metallic, like blood, mixed with the bitter sting of burnt ozone. I turned to Claire, who had dropped her camera. Her trembling hands were clasped tightly over her ears, as if trying to block out the noise. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes were locked on the wall behind me. When I turned, I saw why. The symbols on the floor were no longer just glowing. They were crawling. Thin, jagged lines stretched out from the spiral, climbing the walls and spreading across the ceiling. The patterns moved like living veins, pulsing with an eerie red light that bathed the room in a hellish glow. In the center of it all, the shadow figure began to reform, dragging itself together from the air like smoke coalescing into flesh. Its head jerked unnaturally as it locked onto me. It spoke, but not with words. You, envelop, the sound invaded my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. My name reverberated through my skull, spoken in 1,000 overlapping voices. The pressure was unbearable, like my brain was splitting in two. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, and screamed. But then it was gone. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted as suddenly as it had descended. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it might have been over. But then the walls began to bleed. Thick, dark liquid oozed from the cracks, dripping onto the floor and pooling around the glowing symbols. It wasn't just the sight that made my stomach turn. It was the smell, decay, rot, and something else, something unnatural, something alive. Move, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. He grabbed Sarah, who had been standing frozen in the center of the room, staring blankly at the spiraling symbols. She didn't resist as he pulled her away. Her eyes never left the markings. Even as Ethan and Tyler finally managed to force the door open, we spilled into the hallway, stumbling over one another in our desperation to escape. The whispers followed us, echoing down the corridors like a chorus of the damned. The air here was colder, the stench less suffocating, but it was no comfort. The walls seemed to close in around us, the flickering fluorescent lights casting distorted shadows that danced and twisted like they had minds of their own. As we ran, the building seemed to shift. Hallways stretched longer, doors appeared and vanished, and the layout walked into something impossible. Claire's camera beeped erratically, capturing fleeting images of things I didn't want to see. Fleeting figures in the corners of the frame, hands reaching from the shadows, faces pressed against the glass of boarded-up windows. Finally, we burst into what looked like the main lobby. The room was massive, its vaulted ceiling covered in peeling paint and dangling wires. A grand staircase dominated the space, leading up into yet more darkness. But here, the air felt wrong in a different way. It wasn't just heavy, it was charged, humming with a low-frequency vibration that set my teeth on edge. Sarah collapsed to her knees, clutching the journal she had picked up earlier. Bah, walls. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, frantically scanning the text. "It's not random," she whispered, more to herself than to any of us. "The symbols, they're summoning something. It's already here." I didn't want to ask what she meant. I didn't want to know, but the words spilled from my mouth before I could stop them. "What's here?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "The veil. It's thin here, and we've torn it open. Before I could process her words, the air around us shifted. A deep, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. The lights flickered wildly, and then, one by one, they exploded, plunging us into darkness again. And then I felt it. Something cold, something wet, brushing against my ankle. I pointed my flashlight down, and what I saw turned my blood to ice. The shadows were no longer just shapes. They were alive, writhing, creeping toward us like a tide of living darkness. The writhing shadows didn't stop. They poured into the room like a slow-moving flood, their tendrils slithering across the floor, scaling the walls and curling along the edges of the ceiling. My breath hitched as I felt them brush against my leg again, an icy, numbing sensation that made my skin crawl. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it was weak, swallowed up by the living blackness that seemed to have no end. I called out to the others, but my voice felt small, lost in the oppressive hum that vibrated through the air. It wasn't just a sound. It was a force, pressing down on me, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I turned and saw Marcus dragging Sarah toward the staircase. Her face was pale, her eyes glazed over, and she clutched the journal so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The rest of us stumbled after them, our movements sluggish and disjointed as if the shadows were pulling us back. We reached the base of the staircase, just as the first tendrils of darkness began to pull themselves upright. They stretched and twisted into shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Their limbs were too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, and their hollow eye sockets seemed to follow our every move. One of them took a step forward, its shadowed foot sinking into the floor, like ink spreading through water. "Move!" Marcus' shout snapped me out of my paralysis. He shoved Sarah up the stairs, and we all scrambled after her, tripping over our feet in our desperation to escape. The shadows followed, their movements jerky and erratic, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and immediately regretted it. The shapes were closer now, their distorted faces contorted into expressions that could only be described as hungry. The staircase seemed endless, spiraling upward into a darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was pushing against me. My legs burned, and my chest felt tight, but I didn't dare stop. Behind me, the whispers began again, a cacophony of overlapping voices that spoke in a language I couldn't understand. The sound was maddening, drilling into my skull like nails on a chalkboard. When we finally reached the top, the hallway stretched out before us, impossibly long and lined with doors. The walls were covered in the same pulsing, spiraling symbols we had seen downstairs, their faint red glow casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered as if alive. Sarah stumbled to a stop, clutching the journal as she turned in circles, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispers and the hum. It's watching us. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. I could feel it too. That oppressive, suffocating presence that had been with us since we first entered the building. It wasn't just in the room. It was in us, crawling under our skin, digging into our minds. I felt its weight pressing down on my thoughts, twisting them, pulling at the edges of my sanity. Ethan tried one of the doors, but it wouldn't budge. He slammed his shoulder against it, his grunts of effort echoing down the hallway, but it was no use. Tyler tried another door, with the same result. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. The shadows at the far end of the hallway began to move again, creeping closer with every passing second. Sarah dropped to her knees, flipping through the journal with trembling hands. "There has to be a way out," she muttered, more to herself than to any of us. "There has to be." The journal was ripped from her hands. None of us saw it happen, but one moment it was there, and the next it was gone, yanked into the darkness. Zara let out a choked sob as she scrambled after it, but Marcus grabbed her, pulling her back just as one of the shadow figures lunged forward. Its elongated arms stretched out, fingers like jagged claws. But it stopped just short of where we stood. The air between us shimmered faintly, like a barrier had been erected, holding it back for now. "We're running out of time," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "Whatever that thing is, it's not going to stop." I scanned the hallway, searching for any sign of escape. My flashlight beam landed on a hatch in the ceiling, just above a broken ladder bolted to the wall. It was barely hanging on, its rungs rusted and warped, but it was our only option. "There," I shouted, pointing it out. Marcus was the first to act, boosting Sarah up to grab the lowest rung. The ladder groaned under her weight, but it held. One by one, we climbed, the whispers growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. When it was my turn, I hesitated, glancing back at the hallway. The shadows were moving faster now, their shapes less human and more monstrous, their limbs twisting and merging into grotesque forms. I climbed. My hands were slick with sweat, and the ladder felt like it might crumble beneath me, but I didn't stop. When I reached the top, Marcus pulled me through the hatch, and we slammed it shut behind us. For a moment, the whispers stopped. The hum quieted. The air was still. But it wasn't over. The moment the hatch slammed shut, an eerie silence engulfed us. It was almost worse than the whispers. I couldn't hear my own breath, though my chest was rising and falling as if I'd just sprinted a mile. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that it felt as though the sound might shatter me from the inside out. The others weren't much better off. Sarah crouched in the corner, her shoulders shaking as silent sobs racked her body. Marcus stood with his back pressed against the wall, gripping the metal latch like his life depended on it. Ethan paced in short, jerky steps, muttering something under his breath that none of us could make out. We were in what looked like an attic, though it stretched impossibly far. Wooden beams arched overhead, their edges coated in thick cobwebs that glistened faintly in the dim light filtering through cracks in the slanted roof. Piles of broken furniture, old trunks, and forgotten relics created a labyrinth of debris that seemed designed to trap us. It was suffocating. The air heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. As I scanned the room, my eyes caught on something glinting in the faint light. At first, I thought it was just a shard of broken glass, reflecting back at me. But when I moved closer, I realized it was an old mirror. Its surface cracked and warped as though it had been smashed and then hastily pieced back together. The frame was ornate, its golden edges tarnished with time. But what drew my attention wasn't its beauty. It was the reflection. It was wrong. I stared at myself, or at least the version of me staring back. My reflection's eyes were wide and hollow, the pupils so dilated they swallowed the irises entirely. My face was pale, gaunt, and my lips were moving, though I wasn't speaking. I froze, a shiver crawling up my spine as I tried to look away. But I couldn't. My reflection mouthed words I couldn't hear. Its movements deliberate, intentional. It leaned closer, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it might step out of the glass entirely. Marcus' voice snapped me back to reality. "Don't look at it," he barked, yanking me backward by my arm. The force sent me stumbling, and I crashed into an old trunk, its lid slamming shut with a deafening bang. "It's not real," he continued, his voice shaking. "None of it is. Don't give it the power." Don't give it the power, but it felt real. The reflection was still there, and though I wasn't looking, I could feel its gaze boring into me. My skin prickled, as if invisible hands were brushing against me, cold and clammy. I forced myself to focus on the others. Sarah hadn't moved from her spot in the corner, though her eyes were fixed on something in the shadows near the far wall. Ethan had stopped pacing and was standing unnervingly still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though listening to a voice only he could hear. I approached Sarah cautiously, keeping my eyes averted from the mirror. "Sarah, what do you see?" I asked, my voice low, though I didn't know why I was whispering. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, monotone, devoid of the panic that had consumed her just moments before. "It's here," she said. "It's been waiting for us." I followed her gaze, though every instinct screamed at me not to. In the shadows, just beyond the reach of the dim light, something moved. It wasn't like the shadows downstairs. This was different. It didn't creep or slither. It loomed, its form shifting and expanding as though feeding off our fear. Its presence was overwhelming, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Marcus moved toward us, keeping his back to the wall. "Hey, we need to keep moving," he said. "This place is a trap. If we stay here, we'll never—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as a low, guttural sound filled the attic. It wasn't a growl or a whisper. It was something deeper, more primal, vibrating through the air and into my bones. The shadows near the far wall began to take shape, forming into something almost human, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were too long, its torso twisted at odd angles, and its face, if it could even be called that, was a blank, featureless void. "We need to go. Now," Marcus shouted, grabbing Sarah and pulling her to her feet. Ethan didn't respond, his gaze still fixed on something none of us could see. Marcus cursed under his breath and yanked him toward the center of the room, but Ethan fought back, his movements frantic and wild. "It's too late," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've already let it in." The room began to shake, the beams above creaking under the strain. The mirror shattered, the pieces scattering across the floor like jagged shards of ice. The air grew colder, and the light filtering through the cracks in the roof flickered, as though something massive was passing overhead. Marcus didn't wait. He grabbed Ethan by the collar and dragged him toward the far end of the attic, where another trapdoor was barely visible beneath a pile of debris. I followed, pulling Sarah along as she stumbled, her legs unsteady. The guttural sound grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping and echoing as the shadow creature stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. We reached the trapdoor just as the creature's clawed hand stretched out, its fingers curling around the edge of the debris pile. Marcus wrenched the door open, revealing a ladder that led down into darkness. Without hesitation, he pushed Ethan through, followed by Sarah. I went next, the cold air from below rushing up to meet me as I descended into the unknown. As I climbed down, I heard the last echoes of the creature's voice, a single word that sent a chill through my entire being. "Run?" The ladder creaked beneath me as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. My fingers gripped the rungs so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I couldn't let go. Below, Sarah and Marcus whispered urgently, their voices muffled by the oppressive darkness. Ethan's muttering had returned, his words sharp and clipped, as if he were in a one-sided argument with something none of us could see. The moment my feet touched the ground, I realized this new space wasn't much better. It was a cavernous cellar, its walls carved from rough stone, damp and slick with moisture. The air smelled metallic, like rust, and something sour. Dim light came from a single bulb, swinging precariously above, casting long, erratic shadows that danced along the walls. Before I could catch my breath, Marcus grabbed my arm and yanked me forward. "We can't stop," he hissed. His eyes were wide, his face pale, his usual composure replaced by something raw and frantic. Sarah followed close behind, her hand clutching the back of my jacket like a lifeline. Ethan lingered near the ladder, his gaze fixed upward, as though he could still see the attic above us. "Move, Ethan," I urged, my voice trembling. "We have to keep going." He didn't respond, his lips twitching as he muttered under his breath. I didn't want to leave him behind, but the guttural sound from above was growing louder. The trapdoor slammed shut with a resounding thud, and the ladder groaned as if something heavy was pressing against it. Marcus didn't wait. He took the lead, weaving through the cellar's maze of pillars and debris. The uneven ground was littered with broken glass, old tools, and what looked like dried bloodstains. Every step felt precarious, the silence punctuated only by our labored breathing and the distant drip of water echoing in the shadows. We reached a narrow corridor, the walls closing in as if the space itself were alive, trying to swallow us whole. The air was thick, almost choking, and my chest tightened with every breath. I could feel Sarah trembling behind me, her grip on my jacket tightening with each step. "This isn't right," she whispered. "It's changing." I didn't know what she meant until I looked closer. The walls weren't just damp, they were pulsing. The stone shifted, rippling like water, disturbed by an unseen force. Faint impressions began to emerge, shapes that looked almost human, their faces distorted in silent screams. My stomach churned, and I forced myself to look away. Marcus stopped abruptly, his hand raised to signal silence. Ahead, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. The floor was uneven, jagged rocks jutting out like broken teeth, and the walls were lined with more of those horrifying impressions. In the center of the chamber stood a large stone altar, its surface slick with a dark, viscous substance that glimmered in the weak light. Ethan finally caught up to us, his face ashen. He didn't look at any of us, his eyes fixed on the altar. "It's here," he said, his voice hollow. "This is where it ends." "No," Marcus snapped, his voice harsh. "We keep moving. There has to be another way out." But even as he spoke, the walls seemed to close in further, the chamber growing darker, the air heavier. The faint whispers we had heard in the attic returned, but now they were clearer, more insistent. They weren't just whispers. They were voices, overlapping and jumbled, each one clawing for attention. I stepped closer to the altar, compelled by something I couldn't explain. My reflection stared back at me from the dark liquid pooling on its surface, but it wasn't my face. It was the same hollow-eyed version I had seen in the attic mirror, its lips moving soundlessly. "Don't touch it," Marcus warned, his voice sharp. But it was too late. The moment my hand grazed the surface, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against my skull like a vice. The room shifted violently, the walls bending and warping, the impressions in the stone coming to life. They stepped out of the walls, figures half-formed, their bodies twisted and broken, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded us, their featureless faces turned toward the altar, their presence overwhelming. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place, as one of them reached out, its hand brushing against my arm. It wasn't cold like I expected. It was burning, searing pain that shot through me, forcing a scream from my lips. Marcus grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back. "Run," he shouted, shoving me toward the far side of the chamber. And Sarah followed, her sobs choking her words as she stumbled over the uneven ground. Ethan didn't move. He stood by the altar, his arms outstretched, his head tilted back as if welcoming whatever was coming. "We can't leave him," I yelled, but Marcus didn't stop. "We've student. Stop up." The figures were closing in, their movements growing faster, more coordinated. The air was thick with the sound of their shuffling steps, and the low guttural noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We reached another corridor, this one even narrower, the ceiling so low we had to crouch. Behind us, the chamber filled with a blinding light, and Ethan's voice rang out, a single, agonized scream that echoed long after we lost sight of him. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, each step sinking us deeper into the labyrinth of stone and shadow. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, and the taste of fear clung to the back of my throat like acid. Marcus moved ahead, his movements hurried but careful. Sarah clung to my side, her presence a grounding force against the suffocating darkness. I tried not to think about Ethan. His scream still echoed in my head, jagged and raw, as if it had been etched into my mind. I didn't know what had happened to him, but the light that had consumed the chamber felt final, like a door slamming shut. There was no going back. The corridor widened abruptly, spilling us into a cavern that seemed to defy logic. The ceiling soared impossibly high, disappearing into shadows that writhed like living things. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, a mix of jagged rock and slick, pulsing patches of what looked like flesh. The air was heavier here, tinged with the coppery scent of blood, and something sharper, more acrid. In the center of the cavern stood a massive, circular gate carved from obsidian. Its surface shimmered with an oily sheen, and the symbols etched into its frame pulsed faintly as if alive. A faint hum emanated from it, low and constant, vibrating in my bones. I didn't want to get closer, but the cavern seemed to funnel us toward it, the space narrowing the moment we hesitated. Marcus approached the gate first, his hand brushing against the symbol. The hum grew louder, resonating in a way that made my teeth ache. "This is it," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound. "It's a way out." Sarah pulled at my sleeve, her voice trembling. "We can't trust it. Look at this place. Nothing here is safe." But Marcus was already moving, tracing the symbols with his fingers. And as he did, the shimmering intensified, the oily surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. I stepped back instinctively, the primal part of me screaming to run. But my feet wouldn't obey. Suddenly, the gate flared with light, a sickly green glow that filled the cavern. The symbols twisted and warped, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed to pulse with malevolence. The hum became a roar, deafening and relentless, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. Marcus turned to us, his face illuminated by the eerie glow. "We have no choice," he shouted. "This is the only way." Before I could respond, the gate burst open, the oily surface peeling away, to reveal a swirling vortex of darkness. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was a void, a yawning chasm that seemed to devour everything it touched. The air around it warped, distorting the cavern and pulling at us with an invisible force. Marcus stepped closer, his body silhouetted against the void. He didn't hesitate, his movements deliberate as he reached for the edge of the gate. But before he could cross the threshold, something shot out of the vortex, a tendril of darkness, impossibly fast and utterly silent. It wrapped around his arm, pulling him toward the void with a strength that defied reason. He screamed, the sound raw and primal. As he struggled against the tendril, I rushed forward instinctively, grabbing his free arm. But the force pulling him was too strong. The darkness was alive, and it wanted him. "Let go," Marcus yelled, his voice desperate. "You'll get pulled in too." I didn't let go. I couldn't. But the tendril tightened, the blackness seeping into his skin like ink, spreading through water. His screams turned to choked gasps, his body convulsing as the darkness consumed him. His eyes met mine, wide and filled with terror, before the tendril yanked him into the void. He was gone. The gate's light dimmed, the vortex shrinking until it was nothing more than a faint ripple. The cavern fell silent, the oppressive hum replaced by an eerie stillness. Sarah and I stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Marcus was gone. There was no bringing him back. The ground beneath us shifted, the cavern trembling as cracks began to spread through the stone. The gate pulsed once, twice, and then shattered, the shards of obsidian flying outward like shrapnel. One of them grazed my arm, the pain sharp and immediate, but I barely registered it. The cavern was collapsing, the walls caving in as the shadows writhed and swirled. "Run," Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the nearest tunnel. We sprinted through the darkness, the ground crumbling beneath our feet, and the walls threatening to collapse around us. The sound of the cavern's destruction was deafening, but all I could focus on was putting one foot in front of the other. Suspenseful. We emerged into another corridor, narrower and more claustrophobic than the last. The tremors subsided, but the air was still heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Sarah leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. I wanted to say something, to offer some kind of reassurance, but the words wouldn't come. The corridor stretched on, its walls lined with more of those horrific impressions, their faces twisted in agony. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, crawling into my ears and burrowing into my mind. I shook my head, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. Something was waiting for us ahead. Magnum's Thieves Danae. Bates Karen Dan's Cow. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. An overwhelming presence, watching and waiting. The corridor tightened, forcing us to crouch as we moved forward, the weight of the air pressing down like an invisible hand. Every surface seemed alive, walls pulsing faintly, like they were drawing breath, and the floor slick beneath our feet, oozing with something too dark to be water. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was reluctant to let us go. Sarah stayed close, her face pale and drenched in sweat. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't any need. The dread between us was a tangible thing. The whispers grew louder, not just a noise anymore, but distinct voices, fragmented and layered over one another. They hissed, snarled, and murmured things I couldn't understand, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. My head throbbed with every word, the ache deep and pounding, but I couldn't stop moving. We had to keep going. There was no other option. We stumbled into an open space, and I froze. The cavern before us was unlike anything we had seen before. It was massive, the ceiling too far to see, and the air was filled with a dim, pulsating glow that cast unsettling shadows across the jagged walls. In the center of the space stood a towering structure, something between an altar and a machine, its surface lined with twisted, moving shapes. It radiated power, ancient and terrible, the kind that seeped into my bones and left me shaking. Sarah's voice broke the silence, a hoarse whisper. This is the source. The altar thrummed with life, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to match my heartbeat. It wasn't just an object. It was alive, aware, and watching us. The shadows at its base writhed and shifted, forming shapes that felt too human and yet impossibly raw. I could feel their eyes on me, even though they had no faces, only the suggestion of them. Then the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, as though the cavern itself was holding its breath. I felt a pull, not physical, but something deeper, an undeniable command. My legs moved without my consent, dragging me closer to the altar. Envelop. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging in hard enough to break the skin. "Don't go near it," she screamed, her voice raw with panic. I wanted to stop, to listen to her, but the pull was too strong. Every step brought me closer to the altar, the air thickening around me until it was a struggle to breathe. The shapes at its base began to rise, unfolding into figures that were grotesque yet mesmerizing. They towered over me, their forms constantly shifting, as though reality itself couldn't hold them in one shape. A voice boomed, not from the figures, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was deep, guttural, and incomprehensible, but its intent was clear. It demanded something, a choice, a surrender. The altar flared with light, brighter and more terrible than anything I'd ever seen, and the figures began to converge on me. Sarah screamed my name, but it was distant, drowned out by the roar of the light and the weight of the voice. The figures reached out, their hands, or what passed for hands, stretching toward me. Each touch burned, not my skin, but something deeper, as though they were searing my very essence. Images flashed through my mind, fragments of things I couldn't comprehend, worlds collapsing, faces twisted in anguish, and a darkness so vast it felt eternal. The altar's light intensified, and the pull became unbearable. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, the impact jarring but insignificant compared to the weight pressing down on my soul. The cavern around me began to blur, the shapes twisting and folding in on themselves. It was as though reality was being unraveled, torn apart at the seams. Through the chaos, Sarah appeared beside me, her face streaked with tears and dirt. She was yelling something, but I couldn't hear her. She grabbed my shoulders, shaking me violently, her nails biting into my skin. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't process, but her eyes, they held something fierce, something defiant. She pulled me back, her strength surprising against the force, pulling me forward. The figures recoiled slightly, as though her presence was an affront to them. The light dimmed, just enough for me to see her clearly, her determination cutting through the haze in my mind. "Get up!" she screamed, her voice finally breaking through the roar. "We have to go." Though lessened, and for a moment I thought we might escape. But the altar pulsed again, and the figures surged forward, faster and more aggressive. One of them lashed out, its form twisting into something sharp and jagged, and Sarah screamed. Blood sprayed, hot and vivid, and she collapsed beside me, clutching her side. Something snapped inside me. The fear, the hopelessness, the pull, it all fell away, replaced by a blinding rage. I surged to my feet, dragging Sarah with me, and turned to face the altar. The figures hesitated, their forms flickering, and the light from the altar dimmed slightly. I didn't know what I was doing, but I screamed, pouring everything I had into that sound, defying whatever force had brought us here. The cavern trembled, the altar's light flickering like a dying flame. The figures began to dissolve, their shapes losing coherence, and the pull vanished entirely. The altar shuddered, cracks spreading across its surface, and the cavern filled with a deafening roar as it began to collapse. I grabbed Sarah, half carrying her as we stumbled toward the nearest tunnel. The ground shook violently, chunks of rock falling from the ceiling as the cavern imploded. The light from the altar faded entirely, replaced by an all-encompassing darkness that chased us through the tunnel. We ran blindly, the sound of the collapse growing fainter behind us. Oh, my legs burned, and every breath felt like fire. But I didn't stop. Finally, we burst into the open air, collapsing onto the cold, hard ground. The night sky stretched above us, vast and indifferent, and for the first time, I realized just how fragile we were. Sarah lay beside me, her breathing shallow but steady. I stared up at the stars, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whispers were gone, the pull no longer there, but the memory of that place lingered, etched into my soul. We were alive, but something told me we hadn't escaped entirely. The shadows still felt too close, and the night too quiet. As I stepped out of the van into the oppressive stillness of Haven Moor, I could feel the air thick with an unspoken warning. The town seemed to exist under a perpetual shadow, its faded buildings leaning slightly as though whispering to one another. There was no hum of life here, no bird song, no distant sound of children playing, just silence, thick and suffocating. The forest loomed beyond the edge of town, a sea of dark pine trees standing like sentinels. It was as if they were watching, leaning in to eavesdrop on every step, every breath. The townsfolk had warned me, warned us, all of us on the crew. They said the woods held secrets, best left untouched. But I had a job to do. And I wasn't here to let ghost stories dictate my work. The first signs of something wrong had been subtle. While setting up our equipment near the town square, one of our crew members, Kyle, swore he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a figure darting between the alleys. We laughed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. Still, the nagging feeling stayed with me, a quiet discomfort that only grew as the day stretched into night. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Haven Moor transformed. The forest seemed to awaken, its branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The town's few streetlights flickered erratically, casting fleeting glimpses of shadows that seemed to shift on their own. We retreated to the cabin we had rented for the shoot, eager to review the day's footage. The cabin was cold, colder than it should have been for late September. I wrapped myself in a blanket, staring at the laptop screen as Kyle played back clips from the afternoon. The footage was crisp, professional, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as the video panned across the edge of the forest, a faint distortion caught my eye, a ripple, almost imperceptible. It could have been a trick of the light, or maybe a glitch in the camera. But as I leaned closer, the ripple seemed to take shape, like a shadow reaching out from the trees. "What's that?" I asked, breaking the silence. Kyle paused the footage, rewinding it, frame by frame. There it was again, the shadow. It didn't belong to the trees or the rocks. It was too defined, too deliberate. My pulse quickened as we froze the frame, the shadow frozen in place. It was tall, impossibly tall, and where its head should have been, there was only an empty void. The moment passed quickly, and I dismissed it as paranoia, but the forest had already planted its seeds of doubt. Later that night, I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was Kyle talking in his sleep. But as I strained to listen, I realized the whispers were coming from outside, a soft, rhythmic chant carried on the wind. Against my better judgment, I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The air was colder now, biting through my jacket. The whispers grew louder. As I approached the edge of the forest, my flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unreliable. The trees loomed before me, and I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. And then I saw it. A figure stood just inside the tree line, shrouded in darkness. Its silhouette was impossible, its limbs too long, its head tilting unnaturally. The whispers grew deafening, coming from everywhere and nowhere. My breath caught in my throat as the figure raised an arm, pointing directly at me. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling to the ground. The beam swung wildly, illuminating the edge of the forest. For a fleeting moment, the figure was gone, but the whispers didn't stop. I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. Kyle was awake, staring at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the lights in the cabin flickered. Shadows danced across the walls, shapes that didn't match anything in the room. My heart pounded as I realized the shadows were moving toward us. And then, as suddenly as it started, the whispers stopped. The cabin plunged into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Kyle and I sat frozen, too scared to move, until the first rays of dawn crept through the window. Whatever had happened that night, it had left its mark, and as much as I tried to rationalize it, I knew deep down that something in Havenmore had noticed us. Something ancient, something that didn't want us here, but I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The morning sunlight did little to ease the tension hanging in the cabin. I stared at the cold, untouched coffee in front of me, my hands shaking slightly as I replayed the events of the night before in my mind. Kyle sat across from me, his face pale and gaunt, like he hadn't slept in weeks. Neither of us spoke at first, the silence between us as heavy as the weight in my chest. The forest loomed just beyond the cabin windows, its shadow creeping into my peripheral vision, no matter where I looked. The logical part of my brain screamed for answers, demanding that I rationalize what I had seen. But the part of me that had stood frozen in terror last night whispered something far worse. Maybe there was no explanation. Maybe what I saw wasn't meant to be understood. By mid-morning, the rest of the crew had returned from their lodgings in town, cheerful and oblivious. Their laughter grated against my nerves as they unloaded gear and set up for the day's shoot. I envied their ignorance. We were scheduled to film a series of interviews with the remaining townsfolk, an almost superstitious population, reluctant to speak openly about the town's past. The locals' hesitation had frustrated me initially, but now I understood. There was a reason they didn't talk about the woods, a reason they avoided the tree line like it was cursed. The first interview was with a man named Elias. He was old, his leathery skin etched with deep lines that spoke of hard years. He sat stiffly in the chair we'd provided, his eyes never leaving the camera lens. When I asked about the history of Havenmore, he hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly to the window behind me, where the forest loomed in the distance. "Some things are better left buried," he said finally, his voice hoarse and uneven. "You dig too deep, and you might not like what you find. Well, the cryptic response sent a shiver through me, but I pressed him further. His answers became shorter, more evasive. When I asked him directly about the forest, he froze, his expression unreadable. The air in the room shifted, heavy and oppressive. Finally, he leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "It watches," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "The woods see everything, and if you stare too long, it might stare back." I didn't have a chance to ask what he meant. Elias stood abruptly and left without another word, leaving me and the crew in stunned silence. I tried to dismiss his warning as the ramblings of an old man, but his words stayed with me, burrowing into my mind like a splinter. The second interview was even stranger. A woman named Clara sat down in front of the camera, her eyes darting nervously toward the forest every few seconds. Her hands trembled as she spoke about her life in Havenmore, though her answers were vague and evasive. When I mentioned the strange occurrences from the night before, her face drained of color. "Made dear. Super color." She refused to answer, shaking her head as if even acknowledging my question was too dangerous. The day dragged on, each interview only deepening the unease gnawing at me. By the time we finished filming, the sun was sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town. The crew packed up quickly, eager to return to their lodgings before dark. I envied their ignorance. They hadn't seen the figure. They hadn't heard the whispers. As night fell, I found myself drawn back to the footage from the previous day. Kyle sat beside me, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the laptop screen. We scrolled through the files, searching for anything unusual. At first, everything seemed normal. Dull. The footage was crisp and clear, the sound quality flawless. But then we saw it again. The shadow. It flickered at the edge of the frame, just barely visible. This time, it wasn't standing still. It moved, slow and deliberate, slipping between the trees like it was watching us. My pulse quickened as we froze the frame, zooming in as far as the resolution would allow. The shape was almost humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Elongated limbs, a head that seemed too small for its body. The image sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't look away. Kyle leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you think it's following us?" Intuition. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I didn't respond, because deep down, I was afraid he might be right. We stayed up late into the night, combing through the footage in search of more clues. The shadows appeared sporadically, always on the edges, always moving. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reaching out for us. The realization settled in my chest like a stone. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. My dreams were filled with twisted branches and whispers, the forest closing in around me. When I woke, my skin was cold and clammy, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was rising, but the light did little to ease the sense of dread that had taken root inside me. I knew we couldn't stay in Havenmore much longer, but leaving wasn't an option. Not yet. Not until I understood what was hiding in those woods. The morning passed in a haze of activity, though I barely registered any of it. My mind was still anchored in the forest, to the whispers and the shifting shadows that seemed to beckon us closer. The crew bustled around me, unaware of the storm brewing inside my head. I envied their focus, their ability to compartmentalize. I couldn't. The forest had taken hold of my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. After breakfast, I made a decision that I didn't share with the others. There was no way I could continue with the project without understanding more about what we were up against. Elias and Clara weren't going to give me answers. I would have to find them myself. The idea of stepping into the forest again sent a ripple of dread through me, but I pushed it down. The fear was irrational, I told myself. This was just a patch of trees, nothing more. Grabbing a camera and a flashlight, I slipped away from the group, pretending to check on some equipment near the edge of the clearing. Once I was certain no one was watching, I stepped into the trees. The air changed instantly, the temperature dropping several degrees. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight, casting the forest in a dim, almost twilight glow. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. But it didn't make me feel any safer. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Tracks, signs of an animal. Proof that the shadow we'd seen on the footage was nothing more than a trick of the light. Deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. The weight of something unseen pressing against me. The sense that I was being watched. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But I forced myself to keep moving. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't the kind of quiet you'd expect in the woods, filled with the chirping of birds or the rustling of leaves. This was a suffocating, unnatural stillness, broken only by the sound of my footsteps crunching on the underbrush. The deeper I went, the more oppressive it became, until it felt like the forest was closing in around me. And I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the shadows played against the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. The figure was standing just ahead, partially obscured by the thick foliage. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it was watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised the camera, trying to focus the lens. The screen flickered, static crackling through the speakers, and for a moment, I thought the equipment was malfunctioning. But then the figure moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift, like it was leaning toward me. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the camera. The flashlight wavered in my hand, the beam dancing across the trees. But when I steadied it, the figure was gone. I stood frozen, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't want to stay, but I also couldn't leave. Not yet. I forced myself to take another step forward, scanning the area with the flashlight. The trees seemed denser here, their twisted branches intertwining above me like skeletal hands. The path I'd been following had disappeared, replaced by a maze of roots and undergrowth. I wasn't sure how long I wandered, but the farther I went, the more disoriented I became. The forest had an almost labyrinthine quality, and no matter which direction I turned, I couldn't find my way back. Panic began to set in, the realization that I might be lost twisting my stomach into knots. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind. It was so soft that I might have imagined it, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The whisper came again, closer this time, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo through the trees, surrounding me on all sides. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. My throat was dry, my voice caught somewhere between my lungs and my lips. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were a cacophony of unintelligible noise. I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the ground, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and then the laughter began. It was soft at first, almost childlike, but it quickly grew louder, more distorted. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees until I couldn't tell which direction it was coming from. My chest tightened, and I scrambled to pick up the flashlight, fumbling in the dirt as the laughter swirled around me. When I finally grabbed the flashlight and pointed it ahead, the beam landed on a tree just a few feet away. Carved into the bark was a symbol, a circle with an X through it, surrounded by jagged lines. It was crude, almost as if it had been etched in a hurry, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine, and I saw the figure again. It was closer this time, its shape more distinct. It stood motionless, its elongated limbs and hollow eyes staring back at me. The camera in my hand began to shake, the screen flickering with static once more. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The laughter grew louder, more twisted, and I realized it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the figure, it was gone. The panic didn't leave me, not even as I forced my legs to move, stumbling blindly through the maze of trees. My breath came in shallow gasps, each step a fight against the tightening grip of fear. The forest seemed alive, shifting and twisting, reshaping itself with every move I made. The symbol carved into the bark burned in my memory, its crude lines etched into my thoughts as though it had been branded there. The flashlight's beam wavered ahead of me, cutting through the oppressive darkness, but it felt useless. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, the trees pressing closer together the farther I ventured. The whispers had faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that only deepened my dread. I wanted to scream, to call out for someone, anyone, but my voice remained trapped in my throat. And then, there it was again. The figure. It stood in the distance, partially obscured by the dense foliage. This time, there was no mistaking its presence. It wasn't a shadow, wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. And it was watching me. The flashlight flickered in my trembling hand, the beam struggling to pierce the gloom as I took a hesitant step forward. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I had to see it. I raised the camera, its lens focusing shakily on the figure. Static crackled through the screen, distorting the image, but I pressed on. My pulse thundered in my ears as I inched closer, the figure remaining motionless, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its elongated limbs and unnatural stillness sent a chill coursing through my body. A primal fear I couldn't rationalize. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive silence thickening as I reached out, my trembling fingers brushing against the rough bark of a nearby tree. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, a faint distortion that made my vision swim. I blinked, my head spinning as a low hum filled my ears, growing louder with each passing second. And then it was gone. The space where it had stood was empty, the shadows reclaiming it as though it had never been there. The hum faded, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. My mind raced, desperate to make sense of what I'd seen, but there was no explanation that didn't lead back to the impossible. I don't know how long I sat there, my back against the tree, my thoughts spiraling. The camera lay discarded in the dirt, its screen blank, the battery drained. I hadn't been filming for more than a few minutes, but it was as if the forest had drained a life from it, from me. When I finally gathered the strength to stand, my legs felt like jelly, my body heavy with exhaustion. The symbol on the tree loomed above me, its jagged lines catching the faint glow of the flashlight. I traced it with my fingers, the grooves deep and deliberate. It wasn't random. It meant something I didn't want to understand. The whispers returned as I stumbled back through the forest, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried an intent that chilled me to my core. They wanted me to follow, to go deeper into the woods, to uncover whatever truth lay hidden there. But I couldn't. Not now. Now. May not ever. I don't remember how I made it back to the clearing. One moment, I was lost in the labyrinth of trees. The next, I was collapsing onto the soft grass, the faint glow of the campfire in the distance. The others were there, their voices muted, their laughter a distant hum. I wanted to run to them, to tell them what I'd seen, but my body refused to move. The weight of the forest clung to me, its presence a shadow I couldn't escape. As I lay there, staring up at the canopy of stars, I felt it again, the eyes, watching me, waiting. The figure wasn't gone. It had followed me out of the woods. Inuviani, Fiors, and it wasn't alone. Shiwamna, it wasn't alone. The fear didn't leave me. It would leave me. It followed, slithering like a shadow through the corners of my mind, weighing on every step I took. The others at the campsite hadn't noticed anything wrong when I returned. Or maybe they were too busy pretending everything was normal. It was easier that way, I guessed, to ignore the tension that crackled in the air like static, to dismiss the unease gnawing at the edges of our sanity. But I couldn't ignore it. Not after what I'd seen. I didn't sleep that night, while the others huddled around the fire, laughing too loudly at stale jokes. I kept my distance, eyes fixed on the forest's edge. The trees loomed in the darkness, their twisted silhouettes swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever I'd encountered wouldn't come back. But deep down, I knew better. The camera sat beside me, useless now, its battery drained beyond revival. I should have been relieved. It was proof, wasn't it? Proof that something unnatural had happened. But all I felt was dread. If the camera had captured anything, I wasn't sure I wanted to see it. What if it revealed more than I could comprehend? What if it proved I wasn't imagining any of this? Around midnight, the fire died down, and the group began to disperse, their laughter fading as they retreated to their tents. I stayed outside, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, my back against the damp earth. The night stretched on, oppressive and unyielding, until every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, felt like a threat. And then I heard it, the whispers. They were faint at first, just a murmur carried on the wind, but they grew louder, more insistent. I bolted upright, scanning the darkness with the flashlight's weak beam. The voices came from the trees, beckoning, pulling me toward them with an invisible force. I couldn't resist. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drumbeat of warning, but my legs moved anyway, carrying me closer to the edge of the woods. The whispers weren't alone. Shapes flickered in the shadows, barely perceptible, but undeniably there. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand, its beam dancing over the gnarled trunks and tangled undergrowth. The shapes shifted, darting between the trees, too quick to follow. My breath hitched as one of them paused, lingering just long enough for me to catch a glimpse of its form. It wasn't human. The thing was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and angular, like the branches of a dead tree. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a smooth, featureless void that seemed to absorb the light. It tilted its head, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity, and I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. Darkness swallowed me, and the whispers grew deafening. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake the others, but my body refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid and unnatural, like a puppet with invisible strings. My pulse thundered in my ears as it reached out, one spindly arm extending toward me. The air around it shimmered, bending reality like heat rising from asphalt. And then, just as it was about to touch me, it stopped. The whispers fell silent, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The figure retreated, melting into the shadows, as though it had never been there. The oppressive weight lifted, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. When I finally mustered the courage to move, I scrambled back to the campsite, my legs weak and unsteady. The others were still asleep, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding around us. I crawled into my tent, pulling the flimsy fabric around me like a shield, and waited for the dawn. But the whispers didn't stop. Even as the first rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, they lingered, faint but persistent, a constant reminder that whatever I'd seen wasn't gone. It was waiting. The day was a blur of frayed nerves and feigned normalcy. The others tried to engage me, pulling me into shallow conversations about hikes and weather forecasts. But my responses were automatic, detached. My mind was still tethered to the night before, replaying every shadow, every whisper, every impossible movement of that thing in the woods. I clung to daylight like a lifeline, but as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the trees in shades of crimson and gold, my unease grew. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, creeping toward us like fingers. The forest was watching. I could feel it, a malevolent presence pressing in from all sides. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. When night finally fell, the group gathered around the fire again, their laughter a forced imitation of comfort. I sat on the outskirts, the heat of the flames warming my face, but offering no solace. My hands fidgeted with the frayed edge of my jacket, my gaze fixed on the darkness just beyond the firelight's reach. I didn't tell them about the whispers, the figure, the oppressive sense of being hunted. They wouldn't believe me. They'd just laugh, dismiss it as paranoia or an overactive imagination. I stayed silent as they exchanged stories, their voices rising and falling like waves against the encroaching night. But as the fire dwindled and the group's energy waned, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. I scanned the tree line, my heart skipping when I thought I saw movement, a flash of pale, featureless skin among the shadows. The fire crackled, a log collapsing in on itself, sending a shower of embers into the air. The sudden burst of light illuminated the trees for a fleeting moment, and I saw it. The figure was back, its elongated limbs curling unnaturally as it crouched just beyond the clearing. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, or whatever served as its gaze, locked on me. I shot to my feet, my breath catching in my throat. The others turned to me, their faces masks of confusion and annoyance. "What's your problem?" one of them asked, but their voice sounded distant, muffled. The blood pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. "It's there," I whispered, my voice trembling. "In the woods. It's watching us." They laughed. Of course. One of them even got up, pretending to search the trees with exaggerated bravado. Nothing here, they said, gesturing grandly to the empty forest. But I knew better. I could still feel it. I could still see it. I didn't sleep that night. While the others retired to their tents, I stayed by the fire, feeding it kindling in broken branches to keep it alive. The whispers hadn't returned, but the figure stayed, lurking just beyond the firelight. It never approached, never made a sound, but its presence was suffocating. By dawn, I was a wreck. The others teased me for staying up all night, but I ignored them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one taking this seriously, the only one who understood the danger we were in. I wanted to leave, to pack up, and get as far away from this place as possible, but the group dismissed my concerns. "It's just your imagination," they said. "You need to relax." But how could I relax when the forest was alive with malevolence? How could I pretend everything was fine when I'd seen what was out there? The day passed in a haze. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound louder. The forest was watching, waiting, biding its time. I kept my distance from the others, my paranoia growing with each passing hour. When night fell again, I felt a sense of dread so profound it was almost paralyzing. This time, I didn't stay by the fire. I retreated to my tent, zipping it tightly and clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Sleep was impossible, but I closed my eyes anyway, hoping to at least shut out the world for a while. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor. My eyes snapped open, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The steps were slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I reached for the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the switch. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, I pointed it toward the sound, my breath hitching as the light landed on something impossibly tall and gaunt. It stood just outside the ring of tents, its featureless face tilted as if studying me. And then it smiled. The smile was a crack, impossibly wide and jagged, splitting its blank face like a wound. My flashlight shook in my hand as the beam wavered over its form. It didn't move closer. It didn't need to. Its presence was suffocating, a weight pressing down on my chest, robbing me of breath and thought. The others, how could they not hear it? Couldn't they feel it? I glanced toward the tents, desperate for any sign of life. But they were still. Too still. The creature's smile widened, the edges splitting further, revealing rows of crooked, needle-like teeth. A sound, low and guttural reverberated through the air, a noise that seemed to burrow into my skull. My hand moved on its own, yanking the tent zipper down. Shiyuv Suki Gao. I stumbled out, the cold night air biting against my skin. But I didn't stop to think. I ran. The forest swallowed me whole. My flashlight dotted wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of gnarled branches and twisting shadows. Behind me, the guttural sound grew louder, shifting into something almost melodic, a warped mockery of a lullaby. The trees seemed alive, their branches clawing at me, snagging my clothes and scratching my skin. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, roots and rocks conspiring to trip me. I fell hard, the flashlight flying out of my hand and skittering away. Darkness closed in, thick and impenetrable. I crawled toward the dim beam of light, my hands scraping against the dirt and debris. Just as my fingers brushed the flashlight, something cold and sharp wrapped around my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly, my heart pounding in my chest. The grip tightened, pulling me backward. My hands clawed at the ground, desperate for something to hold on to. But the forest offered no sanctuary. "Please," I gasped, my voice breaking. "What? Please, let me go." The pull stopped. The forest fell silent. I dared to glance back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The creature loomed over me, its form even more distorted and monstrous. In the faint light, it crouched low, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its hollow eyes burning with a malevolent glow. "You called," it whispered. The voice was wrong, layered, like 100 voices speaking in unison. Each word dripped with malice, carving into my mind like a blade. "No," I stammered, shaking my head. I didn't call you." It tilted its head, its smile never faltering. "Oh, but you did. Every fear, every whisper, every desperate thought. You summoned me." My breath hitched, the words twisting in my head like a cruel joke. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, some twisted figment of my imagination. But the pain in my ankle, the weight of its presence, it was all too real. "Let me go," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I'll leave. I'll never come back. Please." The creature leaned closer, its teeth inches from my face. "You can't leave," it said, the words sinking into my soul. "You're mine now." A sharp pain shot through my ankle as it dragged me further into the forest. My screams echoed, but there was no one to hear them. The trees closed in, their branches weaving together like a cage, trapping me in an endless maze of shadow and despair. I fought, clawing at the ground, kicking against the creature's grip, but it was futile. The forest was alive, and it had chosen me. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of laughter. Not my friends. but something else, something ancient and cruel. It echoed through the trees, blending with the creature's guttural hum. The last shred of light from my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. And then there was nothing. I remember the exact moment I set foot on the muddy road leading into Black Hollow. The old sign at the entrance, rusted and broken, squeaked in the wind. Something about that night felt deeply wrong, as if the air itself were alive and watching me. Rain pelted my hood, and the scent of decaying leaves made my stomach lurch. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I'd heard too many rumors about this forgotten mining town, tucked away in the Appalachian foothills. People whispered of strange lights flickering at night, of shadows moving without a source. Curiosity, or maybe foolishness, propelled me forward. The main street was lined with shuttered storefronts and shattered windows. An old soda ad, its paint flaking off the wall of a boarded-up diner, fluttered in the breeze like it was trying to speak. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of a gas pump, its hose dangling lifelessly, dripping stale rainwater onto the cracked asphalt. The place reeked of abandonment, yet there was something else, a lingering presence that prickled the back of my neck. I kept feeling I was being watched, though every time I whipped around, I only saw the eerie orange glow of distant streetlights that shouldn't have been working at all. It felt as though the entire town was clinging to some half-life, unwilling to die completely. I pressed forward, stepping around a collapsed telephone pole, and heard a faint crunch underfoot. Looking down, I realized I'd stepped on a torn photograph. In it, a group of men stood outside a yawning coal mine entrance, smiling, proud, covered in coal dust. Most had their faces scratched out. In the far corner, I could make out a faint outline of a tall figure in a dark coat. A trick of the camera flash made his eyes look like voids. An uneasy chill crawled up my spine. Ewoody, she pass to. The wind picked up, rattling a metal sign on an old grocery store across the street. My heart pounded so loud that I nearly missed the soft, scraping sound, drifting from somewhere behind the building. It was rhythmic, almost like someone sweeping the pavement. I aimed my flashlight that way, but the light only revealed the alleys, dead end, and piles of rotting crates. The noise stopped. A voice stopped. The silent tension gnawed at me. Determined to find out more, I wandered closer to the old grocery. Its wooden steps creaked beneath my boots. Inside, the aisles were half collapsed, shelves stripped bare, except for a few rusted cans. A stagnant odor clung to every surface. Something scuttled past my foot, and I froze, light sweeping the floor. Just a rat, I told myself. Still, my pulse wouldn't settle. I stepped deeper into the store, trying to ignore the claustrophobic darkness. Toward the back, I found a dusty bulletin board, pinned with scraps of paper and yellowed notices. My eyes landed on a crumpled flyer that read, "Town Meeting. Serious concerns about the mine." Below it, someone had scribbled in trembling handwriting, "Danger below. Don't wake it." My hands shook, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I wanted to believe it was some local prank from ages ago, but the urgency in those words felt real. A noise shattered the stillness. A dragging, scraping sound that came from somewhere behind the broken counter. Heart hammering. I inched closer. I peeked over the counter, expecting a raccoon or stray cat. Instead, I saw scratch marks on the floor, spiraling in bizarre patterns. A frayed rope lay coiled in a corner, and the walls had deep gouges, as though something had tried to claw its way out. Suddenly, something bumped against the boarded-up window from outside. My flashlight flickered across rows of shattered glass and warped wood, but nothing was there. I could have sworn I saw a faint shape slither away, though that might have been a trick of my eyes. Another bump, followed by a hiss of wind. Then, silence. I nearly dropped my flashlight when a loud crash tore through the night. It came from the direction of the mine road, just beyond the edge of town. Adrenaline shot through me, propelling me outside. The rain hammered the pavement, and thunder rolled across the mountains as I hurried down a narrow side street. The buildings crowded on either side like silent witnesses to a dreadful secret. Something about the shadows shifted unnaturally, as though they had a life of their own. Lightning flashed, revealing a crooked structure at the end of the street. A rundown office building with boarded windows. Painted across the front in big, warped letters was the name, Black Hollow Mining Company. My gut twisted. That was the place everyone talked about. The nucleus of this town's misfortune. The moon briefly emerged from behind thick clouds, illuminating the old sign with a pale glow. It felt like an omen. I moved toward the entrance, stepping around debris and broken beams. Water dripped from the sagging roof, forming puddles that reflected the flickering streetlight. Inside, the lobby was a chaos of overturned desks, scattered papers, and a foul stench I couldn't identify. The walls had old safety posters peeling away, and footprints, fresh footprints, led deeper into the hallway, disappearing into the gloom. My mind raced. I half expected to see a stray vagrant or some lost traveler, but the atmosphere was far too charged with tension. It as though something was luring me in. I followed the footprints, each step echoing too loudly in the deserted corridor. The overhead lights were long dead. Only the beam of my flashlight guided me. The corridor opened into a large room full of battered filing cabinets. Strewn across the floor were documents detailing permits, accident reports, and faded maps of the mine shaft. I picked one up, noticing deep red stains on the corner. A chill wormed its way into my core. Sukani. The page showed a network of twisting tunnels branching into the mountain. House. A heavy X was scrawled over a section labeled Unstable, Do Not Enter. My eyes flicked to the far side of the room, where a toppled metal cabinet revealed a gap in the floor. A new frayed ropes dangled from what looked like a crude elevator shaft, descending into absolute darkness. The wind outside rattled the glass in a lone surviving window, and in that moment I thought I heard a moan echo up from the shaft, low, tortured, and unmistakably human. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, gripping the flashlight so tightly my hand cramped. A thunderous boom rattled the building, followed by a gust of chilly air from below. The smell of damp earth and something indescribably foul rushed into my lungs. It was as though the very ground beneath Black Hollow was exhaling, warning me not to step any further. But my curiosity battled my fear. I leaned over the opening, trying to see into the blackness. Edol, alive. The rope seemed to disappear into an impossible depth. That moan rose again, sending goose bumps up my arms. In that instant, lightning illuminated the room through the dirty window, and I caught a glimpse of movement down in the shaft, like a pale limb recoiling from the light. A wave of panic overtook me. My pulse jackhammered, telling me to run. Yet I stood there, teetering on the edge of a discovery I was both terrified and compelled to make. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling like a warning cry through the broken frames of the old building. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something about that moan, that fleeting glimpse of a pale shape, held me in a grim fascination. Then came another crash from somewhere above, as if the roof might cave in. Debris rained down in the hallway. I realized staying put was no longer an option. I had to find out what lay below, or find a way out before the building collapsed around me. With trembling hands, I pulled the rope, testing its strength. It felt brittle, but possibly strong enough to hold my weight for a short descent. I pointed the flashlight down once more, and a sickening unease flooded my veins. The darkness down there seemed alive, pulsing with latent energy. If I descended, there might be no turning back. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the wind. Rain lashed the windows, and the building groaned under the onslaught. I had no choice. Taking one final breath, I gripped the rope with both hands and began lowering myself into the shaft, the smell of damp, ancient corridors filling my lungs. Somewhere below, that moaning sound continued, beckoning me with a horrible inevitability. The echoes surrounded me, as if the depths of the mine were hungry for one more soul. Each inch I descended, the darkness tightened its grip, and I couldn't help but feel I was crossing into a realm where no human should ever tread. My flashlight illuminated dripping walls, streaked with black residue, and old beams hung precariously overhead. I told myself I'd only go a little farther, just enough to see what was making that sound. But deep down, I knew that once I reached the bottom, any hope of retreat might vanish forever. The cold air cut through my jacket, and my grip on the rope was slick with sweat. Below me, that rasping moan grew louder, weaving into the relentless thunder of the storm above. I swallowed hard, forcing down the mounting dread. Each heartbeat hammered the same question in my mind. What am I about to unearth in the belly of Black Hollow? And once it's revealed, will I be able to escape its grasp? I eased myself down, the rope biting into my palms as I descended inch by inch, every small sound magnified in the silence. My boots scraping against slick stone, the dripping of water echoing from somewhere below, the pounding of my own heart reverberating in my ears. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to close in around me, thick and chilled. My flashlight wobbled, sending shaky beams across walls, streaked with veins of coal and unfamiliar stains. A strong mineral odor, mixed with something sour and stagnant, assaulted my senses, making me swallow against a surge of nausea. After what felt like an eternity, my boots touched solid ground. The rope overhead groaned as I released it and shined my light around. The chamber I found myself in appeared more like a tunnel junction than a single room, with multiple pathways branching away into darkness. A few rusted mining carts lay overturned, their wheels frozen by years of disuse. I spotted a broken helmet resting near one cart, its visor cracked as though someone had stomped on it. The entire area felt deserted in the most unnerving way, as though something had chased everyone out in a frenzy and left only debris in its wake. I paused to steady my breath. That eerie moan I'd heard from above was disturbingly absent now. I wasn't sure if its silence was a relief or a threat. My pulse hammered in my throat as I turned toward one of the narrower passages, the walls collapsing inward so tightly that I'd have to walk sideways at points. Before committing, I swept the flashlight in the opposite direction, noticing a flicker of movement in the distance, a faint, fluttering motion that vanished the instant my light caught it. My instincts warned me to keep away from any shifting shadows. But curiosity tugged me forward. Stepping carefully over twisted rails, I approached a set of rotting beams that once formed a crude barricade. It looked like someone had tried to seal off that section of the mine. Bent nails poked out of the boards at jagged angles, and a few old signs lay scattered on the floor, their warnings long faded. One sign was partially legible: "Keep out, cavern unstable." The phrase might have been a final attempt to deter further exploration. Clearly, it hadn't stopped everyone. As I crept closer, the flashlight revealed a black opening just beyond the broken beams. An entrance to a secondary chamber. The air emerging from that gap felt colder, as if whatever lay beyond was cut off from any trace of daylight or warmth. My shoulders tensed, and a deep ache blossomed in the pit of my stomach. With each breath, the sense of being watched returned, like intangible eyes peering from every shadow. I inched through the opening, careful not to snag my jacket on the jagged wood. The space opened up into a wider corridor, with an overhead track system, presumably used to haul ore. Hooks and chains dangled from the rusted rails, swaying slightly as if disturbed by my presence. My flashlight caught glints of metal lying on the ground. Tools, perhaps, or leftover scraps. Edging closer, I realized they weren't tools at all, but shards of what looked like broken medical instruments. Their surfaces tarnished with time. Shapes so twisted it was hard to guess their original purpose. A sense of dread churned in my chest. What would surgical instruments be doing in an old coal mine? I tried to push the question aside, but couldn't ignore the slow-building panic creeping along my spine. My free hand clenched into a fist, knuckles stiff. The silence felt unnatural, as though the entire earth were holding its breath, waiting for me to make a wrong move. My light caught something scrawled on the wall, etched into the rock with violent strokes. I leaned in. A series of symbols I didn't recognize, interspersed with crude shapes of figures tangled together. They reminded me of some cryptic writing, the kind you might find in an ancient ruin. Except this wasn't an ancient ruin. It was an American coal mine, a place that, until a few decades ago, should have been bustling with everyday workers and machinery. Something about the jagged lines suggested desperation, even terror. I let my fingertips hover just above one of the symbols, hesitating to make physical contact. A ping sound reverberated through the corridor, jolting me from my thoughts. I spun around, flashlight slicing the darkness. The chain hooks overhead rattled as though touched by invisible hands. My pulse throbbed in my temples, and for an instant I doubted my sanity. Was the mine shifting under the storm's pressure, or was there truly something moving in the shadows? I forced my feet to move, stepping farther along the corridor, each stride feeling heavier than the last. A strong draft came from the left fork, carrying an earthy stench that knotted my stomach. The moaning had returned, distant but distinct. Each drawn-out wail sent fresh goosebumps prickling over my arms. I followed the sound down a sloping path, the floor slick with mud, and something else I chose not to identify. The passage widened, revealing a large gallery where massive support beams stood like dying trees, leaning at precarious angles. Broken lanterns lay strewn about, their glass shards reflecting my flashlight in tiny sparks. I nearly cried out when I spotted a crumpled shape near one of the beams. The shape wore a tattered uniform with the Black Hollow Mining Company patch on its shoulder. My heart pounded so violently it hurt. I inched closer, shining the beam over the figure. The face was turned away, but the posture looked contorted, arms bent in impossible angles. I couldn't tell if it was a lifeless form or a horrible mannequin. My chest tightened as I reached out, the tip of my boot tapping the figure's leg. No movement. No movement. Relief and dread mingled in my mind. A toxic brew. The uniform was stained beyond recognition, and a ragged hole in the back suggested something more sinister than a mere accident. That moaning sound grew louder, echoing through the cavern in waves that pressed on my eardrums. I tore my gaze away from the figure, fighting the urge to retreat. A row of metal lockers, rusted and half open, lined one wall. I pulled one open, half expecting an avalanche of debris. Instead, I found a broken flashlight, a single boot caked with dried mud, and a small journal with its cover half ripped away. Hands shaking, I picked up the journal. The front page was smeared with black dust, but I could just make out a date from years ago. The next few pages bore frantic handwriting, describing how workers had begun hearing voices in the uncharted tunnels. One line read, "No one believes me. Says it's just the wind." But I saw something move, something that shouldn't be there. Another entry detailed the foreman's decision to dig deeper, despite repeated warnings. The last scribbled sentence was almost unreadable. "If we keep going, we won't see daylight again." A large blot of something dark, possibly dried ink, obscured the final words. A gust of frigid air cut through the chamber, carrying that sorrowful moan once more. I shoved the journal into my jacket, realizing my every instinct screamed that I needed to leave. Yet my legs felt nailed to the ground. I flicked the beam around the space, catching sight of a collapsed section at the far end. The moaning was definitely louder there, as if the source were directly beyond those heaps of rubble. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. My skin prickled with the certainty that the moment I tried to clear that rubble or climb over it, I'd be crossing a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. Lightning flashed somewhere far above, sending vibrations through the earth. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Shivers, vegetables, downs from fuda. The moaning stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Everything went dead quiet, a silence that deafened me with its heaviness. My heart thundered. Should I turn back while I still could? The rope up the shaft might be the only path to relative safety. But then, that lingering question rose again. What if I was already too deep? What if the very thing that inhabited these tunnels was drawing me in for its own purpose? My stomach churned at the thought of something patiently waiting behind the rockfall, biding its time. A soft crunch behind me made me whirl around so fast, I nearly lost my balance. I aimed the flashlight at empty air, only to see a scattering of pebbles skitter across the floor. Another trick of my mind, or something testing me, toying with me. The gloom pressed tighter, my breath going shallow. With trembling hands, I backed away from the collapsed section. Each step felt leaden. Meun ha est. I was determined to search for another exit, or at least find something that resembled a ladder or secondary shaft. My thoughts raced, forming half-baked plans that all seemed doomed. Yet my body moved on autopilot, pushing me to search the perimeter. As I rounded the far side of the cavern, my flashlight picked out a slit in the rock wall, maybe large enough to squeeze through if I turned sideways. A strange hush clung to that narrow space. If I strained my ears, I almost thought I could hear faint breathing from inside, like something was waiting. My palms dampened with sweat, and I could hardly swallow. Another lightning rumble pulsed through the mine, and I felt an urge to run, though I had no idea where. I hovered near the opening, wrestling with the decision: face the unknown or stay in this gloom that seemed to hum with latent menace. The moment stretched on, my pulse thudding. Then, without conscious choice, I found myself edging into the crevice, drawn by a grim curiosity I couldn't suppress. The walls squeezed my shoulders, and the darkness ahead looked thicker than any I'd yet encountered. My light revealed watery streaks down the stone, forming patterns almost like tears. A subtle breeze exhaled from deep within, chilling me to my core. Driven by an odd mixture of dread and resolve, I pressed on, fully aware that every step might be carrying me closer to a point of no return. The gloom enveloped me, the beam of my flashlight seeming puny against the vastness of the shadows. My mind refused to imagine what horrors might be a few feet away, hidden by the blackness. But deep down, a quiet voice kept whispering that I was not alone, and that whatever shared this mine with me had been watching all along, eager for my arrival. I braced myself against the rough stone, inching deeper into that cramped passage where every breath tasted of old dust and damp mineral. My flashlight trembled in my grip, throwing jittery shapes across walls that seemed to close in around me. The hollow quiet magnified the soft scrape of my boots on uneven rock, and with each step, I expected to meet some silent watcher lurking just beyond my field of vision. The air felt heavier here, weighed down by an unseen presence that seeped into my bones and prickled every inch of my skin. A few yards in, the passage curved sharply to the right, revealing a sliver of space that opened into a cramped alcove. My heart pounded as I shined a beam of light around the small pocket of stone, searching for anything out of place. A battered pickaxe with a broken handle lay discarded near the far wall, and beside it, a piece of tattered cloth caught on a jagged outcrop of rock. The cloth looked like part of a shirt or a worker's jacket, shredded as if by something with far too much strength. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step closer. The cloth was stiff, stained by a dark residue that might have been coal dust or something more unpleasant. An uneasy shudder passed through me. I steadied my breathing, pushing onward. The tunnel soon widened enough for me to walk upright without scraping the ceiling. Sounded scraping the ceiling. My foot dislodged a small pebble, which skittered ahead and disappeared into what appeared to be a larger cavern. Beyond that opening, a faint luminescence shimmered, too dim to be daylight, but unmistakably there. Some faint glow, pale and sickly, pulsing in the darkness like a heartbeat. My apprehension spiked. Where was that light coming from? No electrical system could still be functioning in these abandoned depths, and I doubted any phosphorescent mineral would create such a steady glow. I approached cautiously, the ground sloping downward. Water trickled along the walls, forming slick patches underfoot. My flashlight flickered, making my pulse jump. I gave it a shake, and the beam steadied, though deep down I couldn't shake the feeling it would give out on me at the worst possible moment. The faint glow began to intensify, revealing a rounded chamber whose walls glistened as if coated in a thin, wet film. Breathing as quietly as I could, I stepped inside. The source of the glow appeared to be a cluster of odd crystals, jutting from the far side of the cavern, their surfaces reflecting an otherworldly hue. They cast dancing, distorted shapes across the rocky walls, making it look like twisted silhouettes were cavorting in the gloom. My heart hammered at the sight, and I had to remind myself that crystals alone posed no threat. What unnerved me was the possibility that I wasn't the only one observing them. The entire chamber felt charged with tension, as if it had hosted some dreadful event long ago, and the echoes of that moment still lingered, refusing to fade. A sudden scuttling sound made me pivot. My flashlight darted toward the noise, revealing only emptiness. Yet I could have sworn I saw a faint blur slip around the corner, a suggestion of movement low to the ground. The thought of something crawling in the shadows sent a surge of panic through my veins. I took a step backward, debating whether to flee this chamber entirely. Then I spotted what looked like an old wooden crate pushed against the far wall, half crushed by a fallen beam. Telling myself that answers might hide in any clue left behind by former workers, I inched over to the damaged crate. The wood, long decayed, crumbled beneath my hands as I gently pried it open. Inside, I found fragments of a battered notebook and a scattering of pages bound together by a rotting piece of twine. The pages were coated in a layer of coal dust, so I brushed them off, careful not to tear the fragile paper. My flashlight revealed the same frantic handwriting I'd seen in the journal upstairs. Right stairs. Several sentences jumped out at me. We heard screams deeper in the tunnels. No one will talk about it in the daylight. Another line read, whatever was awakened down there, it's not letting go. My mouth went dry, the weight of those words pressing on me like a warrant. I skimmed further, though parts were illegible. One passage tore at my nerves. The foreman insisted we keep going. Then the first shift never returned. We can't keep covering this up. I carefully replaced the pages, a chill gathering at the back of my neck. There was no denying something horrible had occurred here. Something involving more than simple accidents or structural collapses. I thought of the moaning I'd heard earlier, and the strange symbols carved into the stone, and my skin crawled with the suspicion that the original miners had stumbled upon something they never should have awakened. The idea of an old, slumbering force stirring in these tunnels filled me with a dread I couldn't name. From behind the crate came a soft tapping, like nails clicking against stone. My throat tightened. With painful slowness, I swept the flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on a small recess behind the shattered crate. Just darkness. Then a brief flicker of motion, gone in an instant, left me unsure if I'd truly seen it. Anxiety roared through me, urging me to escape this claustrophobic cavern. Yet, a stubborn part of my mind insisted there could be more information here, more clues that might prevent me from walking blindly into an even worse fate. I stood frozen, torn between the urge to flee and the curiosity that brought me here in the first place. That's when a low hum began to tremble through the walls, vibrating in my chest. It felt like the mine itself was coming to life, adjusting its subterranean bones. Dust trickled from the ceiling as the hum intensified into a throbbing pulse. My heart beat in time with it, a sickening synchronicity. Then, as abruptly as it started, the vibration ceased, leaving my ears ringing in the silence. A few loose rocks clattered near the chamber entrance, and I swung my flashlight that way. The passage where I'd entered now seemed darker, as though the faint glow of the crystals had receded behind a veil of shadow. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears. I forced myself to move, crossing back toward the corridor. As I did, I became aware of a new odor, drifting, a bitter chemical stench that made my eyes water. Cautiously, I followed the smell, my pulse jackhammering with every step. The corridor branched again, and I chose the path that seemed to slope upward, hoping it might lead me to an exit, or at least to higher ground. My mind churned through half-formed questions. Had others made it this far? Was there any chance I could find them alive in this oppressive darkness? Or was I simply walking toward the very thing that had driven everyone away? A wave of dizziness hit me as I pushed onward, exhaustion gnawing at my limbs. Still, I couldn't stop. This place seemed to have a will of its own, tugging me deeper into its labyrinth with each passing minute. My flashlight flickered again, but I managed to steady it before it died. Ahead lay an archway of collapsed beams, and behind them, a deeper unknown. I swallowed hard, a single thought echoing in my mind. If I turn back now, I might never learn the truth. If I go forward, I might wish I'd never come. I pressed onward, each cautious step taking me under the splintered arch of collapsed beams. The air grew colder, and I found myself gripping my flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. My lungs strained against the dust and lingering chemical fumes, and I fought an urge to gag. Scrapes of metal against rock drifted from deeper ahead, raising the hairs on my arms. With every breath, I sensed a presence that felt closer than before, as if the mine's darkness had begun breathing in tandem with me. I reached a steep drop-off, blocked by a thick wooden barrier. The timbers looked half-rotten, and deep gashes scarred their surface. Setting a tentative hand on the barrier, I gave a light push, and it wobbled precariously. Beyond the timbers, my flashlight picked out a narrow ledge, zigzagging down to an even darker chamber. Water trickled down the walls, forming glistening streaks that made the descent look slick and treacherous. A breeze rustled up from below, carrying a faint moaning sound that cut through my chest like a raw chill. Crouching low, I slipped past the timbers, boots skidding on damp stone. My flashlight beam flickered across the ledge, revealing rusted bolts hammered into the wall. Maybe once used to secure safety ropes. They appeared decades old, and I doubted they could still bear much weight. Taking a slow breath, I braced a hand against the rock for balance, easing myself down. Each small shift of my foot threatened to send me sliding into the darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears, urging me to be more careful than ever. About halfway down, the moan rippled through the chamber again. It sounded closer, more desperate, as though a human voice had long since faded into something else. A wave of unease pressed in on me, heavier than before. I glanced over my shoulder at the gap above, part of me tempted to climb back out. Yet something compelled me forward. Some mixture of dread and a stubborn need to uncover the truth. When my feet finally touched the bottom, I found myself in a cramped space, nearly swallowing my flashlight's glow. Jagged rocks jutted from the ground, giving the impression of teeth lining the floor. A few steps in, I spotted an old lantern, its glass shattered and its metal frame bent. It lay tipped on its side, as though tossed there in a hurry. I forced myself to step closer, noticing a smear of dark residue on the handle. My stomach churned at the thought of what that residue might be. The moaning stopped abruptly. In the hush that followed, I heard my own heartbeat echoing against the damp walls. My flashlight played across the uneven terrain, settling on a massive wooden door embedded in the rock. Its hinges were corroded, and the surface bore what looked like carved symbols, unfamiliar spirals and lines that resembled those I'd glimpsed earlier. They crisscrossed the door in a twisted lattice, so dense that the wood grain barely showed through. I tried the handle, which gave a dry, rasping rattle, but didn't budge. A sense of panic welled up, and I tugged harder. I tugged harder. The door groaned in protest, sending flakes of rust showering onto my wrist. Then, with a final strained heave, it shifted slightly inward. A stale rush of air escaped through the crack, stirring grit around my boots. My body tensed, bracing for anything that might emerge, but only darkness lay beyond. At this point, turning around felt almost as hazardous as forging ahead. I stepped through, scanning the area beyond for any sign of life. The corridor stretched into blackness, with sporadic support beams warped by time. Something skittered in the corner of my vision, a fleeting shape that darted behind a support post. The hair on my neck stood on end. I approached where it vanished, heart pounding, but saw nothing except footprints in the dusty floor. Several sets of them overlapped, indicating others had come this way, and not all at the same time. With my nerves on edge, I pressed forward again, struggling to keep my breathing steady. The corridor ended in a vaulted space, strewn with rotted crates and debris that reeked of decay. My flashlight fell upon a mound of old machinery, half buried under a collapse of rubble. Among twisted metal beams, I noticed a door-sized opening at the far side, its edges lined with more of those indecipherable carvings. A dim, pulsing glow emanated from inside, sending shadowy flickers across the crates. I felt an oppressive weight settle on my shoulders, as though I were trespassing in a domain claimed by something older and far less merciful. My pulse throbbed in my throat, yet I couldn't turn back. Swallowing hard, I sidled along the debris, careful not to knock anything loose. Every tiny sound seemed amplified. Water dripping, my boots scraping, the creak of old wood. It all formed a discordant symphony that played on my nerves. The glow intensified as I drew nearer to the opening. It pulsated in a steady rhythm that matched the anxious beat of my heart. At the threshold, I paused, every sense screaming that I was about to cross into a place humans were never meant to see. My mind swirled with questions and fears, and outside, I could still hear the distant thunder of the storm raging overhead, reminding me that time was passing. Yet down here, it felt like the hours had ceased to matter, swallowed by an eternal. Bracing myself, I slipped inside, drawn toward that strange light, like a moth fluttering too close to a flame. Shadows writhed across the rock walls, forming shapes I couldn't quite name. I dared not call out, afraid my voice might summon whatever lurked in the gloom. Gloom. Instead, I moved slowly, forcing each step forward, determined to see what had drawn countless souls into these unholy depths and left them forever changed, or worse, never seen again. I took one more step, and the dim glow illuminated a circular space framed by jagged stone walls. My flashlight dimmed in comparison, yet I kept it trained ahead in case that otherworldly light faltered. The floor glistened with slick patches, and a low hum rumbled beneath the surface, as though the rock itself was humming in quiet distress. The hair on my arms stood rigid, and each breath felt heavier than the last. Veins of quartz, or some mineral I didn't recognize, glowed with a faint, pulsing light that seemed alive. They formed patterns almost like veins under skin, twisting upward toward the cavern's ceiling. I shuffled forward, my boots crunching on stray pebbles, wary of making any noise that might disrupt the eerie silence. Each pulse of light resonated with the thrumming sensation that clenched my chest, and I realized my heart was racing in sync with that glowing rhythm. At the far side of the chamber, a collapsed portion of wall revealed an even deeper recess, an uneven gap large enough for a person to squeeze through if they dared. My thoughts drifted back to the scribbled notes I'd seen, the frantic warnings about going too far. Yet here I was, unable to pull myself away. The pale luminescence painted the jagged rock in haunting silhouettes, twisting them into forms that resembled anguished faces. I gripped my flashlight tighter, wishing my pulse would settle. A whisper of movement caught my attention. I swung the beam to my left, pulse hammering in my throat. Near a cluster of glowing crystals, a faint shape flickered, like a figure hunched low or bent unnaturally, with elongated limbs half hidden behind a stone outcrop. I froze, uncertain if it was a trick of the strange light or something actually moving. A crawling sensation slid across my scalp as I strained to see more clearly. Then, without a sound, the shape vanished, leaving only quivering shadows in its wake. Some primal instinct screamed at me to back away, but my legs refused. I forced myself forward, drawn to a narrow path leading from the chamber into deeper darkness. The corridor beyond was stifling and damp, the air thick with an odor that made my stomach turn. My flashlight caught glimpses of old mining tracks, their rails twisted as though some massive force had bent them like wire. Loose gravel shifted under my feet, betraying my presence with every step. A sudden clang echoed through the passage, jarring me so forcefully that I nearly dropped my flashlight. Heart in my throat, I swung the beam around. The noise had come from behind me, near the edge of the large cavern I'd just left. My nerves thrummed with adrenaline as I searched the shadows. I saw nothing, only an echo remained, bouncing off the walls. Yet I sensed I was no longer alone, if I ever truly had been. Drawing a shaky breath, I continued along the track, mindful of the water that trickled from cracks overhead. Each droplet fell like a taunt, punctuating the stillness. A rancid smell intensified, forcing me to breathe through my mouth. My throat felt tight, and beads of sweat formed at my temples, despite the dank chill. At last, the corridor broadened into a small clearing. Ended steamed I'd stray, traded high, beat mine carts lay overturned in the corners, their contents spilled long ago. Chunks of black rock, scraps of cloth, and twisted tools. A crude wooden cross had been jammed into the ground near one of the carts, its edges scorched as if someone had tried to set it ablaze in desperation. I approached the cross, my chest tight with dread. On the ground beside it lay a battered journal, its pages crumpled as though it had been tossed aside hastily. In the glow of my flashlight, I caught sight of a few disjointed sentences. We thought the deeper veins promised wealth, but it all went wrong. A few lines later, he wouldn't stop digging. Something was chanting in the walls. My breath hitched. The final page bore a single word, repeated over and over. Escape. A short metallic squeal snapped my attention, away from the journal. One of the carts shifted, as though nudged by an unseen hand. I aimed my flashlight in that direction, muscles tensed so tightly that pain flared in my neck. For an agonizing moment, the cart stayed still. Then it moved again, inching forward on its own. A shiver rippled through me, and I realized the rails beneath it were trembling. It was as if something below the ground was pushing upward, trying to break free. A sudden jolt swept through the chamber. An underground tremor. Dust and pebbles rained from the ceiling, and the wooden cross wobbled before toppling over with a dull thud. I staggered, planting my hand on the cold rock wall to steady myself. My flashlight beam danced wildly, and for a second I glimpsed something scuttling away on the far side of the cavern. Its silhouette disappeared behind shattered beams, but the sound it made, a wet, scraping shuffle, resonated in my ears. The quake subsided, leaving the space in a suffocating stillness that felt even more unnerving. My mind churned with a single thought: the deeper tunnels might be collapsing, or something far worse might be causing these tremors. Either way, staying put wasn't an option. The path stretched onward, twisting into yet another gaping corridor. A faint hum threaded through the air, reminiscent of the pulsating glow I'd seen earlier. I focused on my breathing, inching toward that next passage. Somewhere distant, a thunderclap rumbled, the storm outside still raging, while I ventured further underground. My flashlight revealed the corridor's jagged entrance, framed by sharp, uneven rock. Each step I took felt like a deliberate choice that sealed my fate, driving me deeper into this labyrinth of secrets that should have remained buried. The shadows ahead beckoned with silent menace, and I could sense the presence I'd been feeling all along. Stronger, closer, waiting for me to cross into its domain. I forced myself onward, knees shaking with each step as I followed the corridor into a region of the mind that felt untouched by time or human presence. The air grew warmer, charged with a strange energy that vibrated in my chest. My flashlight flickered as though struggling against unseen interference, and the echoes of dripping water morphed into faint whispers that sent shivers along my spine. I clutched the light tighter, afraid it might fail me at any moment. A distant pounding noise reverberated through the walls, like a colossal heartbeat pulsing somewhere behind the stone. It drowned out the muted thunder from above, anchoring my attention to the depths. I found myself trying to match its rhythm, an instinctive need to understand what lay ahead. Each throb was heavier than the last, filling the corridor with an ominous cadence that set my nerves on edge. The passage sloped downward into a chamber strewn with broken rails and dislodged support beams. Rusted chains dangled from the ceiling, swinging gently despite the still air. My beam landed on a tattered piece of fabric pinned beneath a fallen post. When I knelt to free it, I discovered it was a jacket sleeve, emblazoned with the faded patch of the Black Hollow Mining Company. A heavy feeling settled in my stomach as I recalled the abandoned journal entries, the frantic pleas for anyone who might read them. I pictured the owner of this sleeve stumbling in the dark, hearing that same dread-inducing pounding. A muffled scraping to my right made me jerk the flashlight around. I saw only a glimpse of motion, an elongated shape retreating behind a collapsed support, too quick for me to identify. My heart lurched, and I forced myself to remain still, listening for any sign of pursuit. The only sound was my ragged breathing, echoing off the damp rock. I had the sudden, unsettling thought that maybe it was just toying with me, drawing me ever deeper into its domain. I pressed on, weaving through piles of rubble. Through piles of rubble, an oppressive smell assaulted my senses, rancid and earthy, like decaying vegetation mixed with old metal. Something about the stench felt alive, almost predatory, as if it radiated from whatever entity lingered in these tunnels. My eyes watered, but I refused to slow down. A surge of adrenaline and a grim determination pushed me forward, though the logical part of my brain screamed for me to turn back while I still had the chance. The corridor tightened around me again, forcing me to sidestep boulders and fractured stone. A few times, I nearly slipped on a slick patch of mud, sending my flashlight skittering in and out of my trembling grip. Each stumble quickened my pulse, as I imagined losing my light down here in the dark, with no way to navigate back. Every so often, I could swear I heard skittering footsteps that stopped whenever I paused to listen. Rounding a final bend, I reached a narrow archway carved into the rock, its edges etched with the same cryptic symbols I'd seen throughout these tunnels. The pulsing noise behind the walls grew louder, reverberating through the ground beneath my boots. My flashlight caught the glint of more twisted equipment. A bent shovel, a battered metal bucket, both coated in a dark residue that I prayed was no more than rust and grime. The twisted shapes of these discarded tools hinted at the unnatural strength or fury of whatever force had warped them. A wave of dizziness struck me, brought on by the unrelenting heat and the rhythmic pounding that now hammered in my ears. I leaned against the archway, sweat trickling down my back, my legs threatening to give out. I thought of the journals of the people who once labored here, who discovered something so terrifying that it forced the whole town to flee or disappear. Now, standing at the threshold of this new darkness, I understood their desperation all too well. Steeling myself, I dragged my sleeve across my forehead and peered into the archway. The faint glow I'd seen before flickered inside, as though dancing shadows battled against the remains of the light. Whatever awaited me on the other side felt ancient and unspeakably hostile, a culmination of every dark rumor surrounding Black Hollow. Part of me yearned to flee, but there was no turning around now. My lungs ached, my thoughts raced, and a raw dread pulsed in my veins. Against all rational judgment, I stepped through, prepared to confront the source of the nightmare that clung to these tunnels. I stepped through the archway, and the air seemed to thicken around me, tightening like an invisible vice across my chest. My flashlight flickered again, struggling against the gloom that pulsed with each muffled beat reverberating through the stone. The heat intensified, along with a sour metallic tang that filled my lungs and made my eyes water. A faint glow illuminated what lay ahead. A sprawling cavity in the earth, larger than any space I had encountered so far. Its walls lined with pulsating mineral veins. Crude scaffolding and shattered beams ringed the perimeter, as though workers had once attempted to carve deeper into these depths before succumbing to terror or worse. A jagged platform stretched over an unfathomable pit at the far end of this monstrous cavern, the remains of some contraption, Heavy chains, rusted pulleys, and a half-collapsed crane suggested they might have lowered large loads down below. My gaze followed the twisted metal to the yawning chasm, where darkness swallowed the pit's bottom. Now and then, a faint wind gusted upward, carrying an unearthly murmur that made my stomach lurch. I advanced with trembling steps, torn between the instinct to run and a dreadful fascination that held me captive. Each heartbeat echoed in my ears, merging with the incessant pounding in the walls. The glow radiating from those mysterious veins flickered in time, as though the rock itself were breathing. My flashlight beam swept across the broken scaffolding, revealing an old control box, battered by time. Its levers and dials were coated in grime, and a thick cable trailed from its side, disappearing into the pit. My mind conjured images of workers standing here, adjusting those dials, oblivious to the horror they were awakening beneath their feet. A creaking sound drew my attention behind me. Something moved along the cavern wall, a faint silhouette, elongated like a figure contorted past human limits. My heart kicked into overdrive, and I raised the flashlight, hands unsteady. The beam picked out a flash of limbs, or perhaps a tail-like extension, slithering behind a jagged corner. My chest constricted, and sweat dampened my hairline. I fought the urge to scream, clinging to the single thread of composure I had left. Summoning what courage remained, I stepped toward the platform's edge. The stench intensified, thick and pungent, as though the pit exhaled decay. My flashlight beam pierced the darkness, barely grazing outlines of what might have been stone formations or heaps of abandoned equipment below. Yet something moved down there, a subtle stirring in that gulf of blackness. The very void seemed alive, waiting to draw me in. A trembling rumble rattled the platform under my feet. Oh, debile. I staggered back, nearly toppling over. Dust rained from overhead, and a length of chain clattered against the crane's frame, sending an echoing clang through the cavern. A savage hiss erupted from somewhere near the pit, followed by a flurry of scraping sounds that made my blood run cold. Whatever lingered in that darkness was no longer content to remain hidden. It wanted me to know it was there. A wave of primal terror crashed over me, urging me to flee. But I couldn't tear my gaze away. My flashlight danced over the edges of the pit, catching glimpses of something that defied reason, a mass of limbs or tentacles, shifting and coiling in the gloom. Each movement dripped with malevolent intent, sending my heart hammering so violently I thought it might burst. Backing away, I collided with a large metal box lying on its side. The lid slid open, revealing half-rotted ropes, a battered harness, and a scattering of tattered documents. My flashlight skimmed over a stamp on one page. Authorized access only. Foreman's eyes. The text below referred to exploratory drilling procedures, but the final lines were scrawled in shaky handwriting. We must seal it, no matter the cost. A growl resonated through the chamber, low and resonant, vibrating up through my legs. My flashlight flickered again, dimming momentarily, and panic nearly overwhelmed me. I glanced frantically around, searching for any hint of an exit. The corridor I'd come from now seemed to vanish into blackness, as though the cavern itself had shifted to trap me. Gritting my teeth, I forced myself to think. The battered harness in the box. Was it some final attempt by the last workers to descend and seal whatever lay below? The pounding in the walls intensified, rattling the scaffolding and making me stumble. In that brief lull, I heard something else, a tortured human-like cry reverberating from the pit, swallowed almost instantly by a deeper roar. My instinct screamed that I was standing on the threshold of something that transcended mere nightmares, a phenomenon that defied explanation or mercy. My vision swam, and a crushing sense of futility gripped me. If I stayed, I risked facing that abomination head-on. If I tried to flee, I might still be caught in a collapse or hunted in the twisting corridors. With shaking hands, I picked up the harness, mind spinning with the thought that maybe, just maybe, the only way to prevent this horror from claiming more lives was to face it. The rope was stiff with age, but it looked sturdier than anything else I'd found so far. My lungs felt caged by the stagnant air, and the pit's black maw beckoned like an open wound. Somehow, the notion of descending into that abyss, harnessed by rotten rope and guided only by failing light, seemed both mad and necessary. I secured the harness around my torso, tightening the worn straps until they dug into my clothes. And fear pulsed in my veins, urging me to reconsider, to run until my legs gave out. Yet the roars from below escalated, and the cavern quaked, chunks of rock tumbling from the walls. Time was an illusion down here, and I felt certain that if I hesitated any longer, the chance to act or to escape would be lost forever. Testing the rope on a sturdy support beam, I exhaled shakily and cast one last look at the corridor behind me. The mineshaft's darkness loomed, as though to say there was no turning back. Then I took the rope in both hands, gripping it with every scrap of will I had left, and swung myself over the edge of the platform. My feet met open air, dangling over the pit as I began my slow, perilous descent. A furious shriek tore through the cavern, and hot wind rushed upward from the pit. My flashlight flared, the beam flickering across writhing shapes, clinging to the rock face below. I forced my focus on the rope, inch by agonizing inch, though my mind spun with the image of those twisted figures, seemingly climbing toward me. Each drop of sweat on my brow felt like ice as I listened to the rope creak, uncertain if the threads would hold under my weight. Below, a swirling gloom churned, shot through with that sickly luminescence from the mineral veins. The roar grew louder, mingling with echoes of my own ragged breath. Adrenaline warred with terror, making my arms shake uncontrollably as I lowered myself further into the impossible blackness. For a moment I almost wished the rope would snap, granting me a swift end, but I pushed the thought aside, gripping the rope tighter, refusing to let the darkness claim me without a fight. The pit seemed to stretch on forever, each foot of descent feeling like a mile. Shrieks and growls battered my senses, and the air became stifling, loaded with the reek of sulfur and rot. My flashlight beam wavered frantically against the slick rock, revealing fleeting glimpses of bone fragments, twisted metal, and shapes that defied explanation. My pulse thundered, each beat a desperate plea for survival. Ames compute a desperate plea for survival. Suddenly, a violent tremor shook the rope, slamming me against the rock wall. Pain shot through my shoulder, and I nearly lost my grip. The harness dug into my ribs, forcing a gasp from my lungs. As I tried to steady myself, a deafening crash echoed from above, an avalanche of debris collapsing onto the platform I'd just left. Broken beams and rubble rained past me into the abyss, clanging off the rock as they fell. My flashlight captured a final glimpse of the entire structure, buckling before the dust consumed it. I hung there, suspended in the suffocating dark, separated from any hope of climbing back up. Tremors rippled through the pit, and my ears filled with an otherworldly howling that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. Everything I had witnessed, shadows moving in corridors, twisted remains of mining equipment, cryptic carvings, coalesced into one horrible certainty. Something in these depths had been awakened, and I was now trapped with nowhere else to go. I forced myself to keep descending, ignoring the searing in my arms and the chaos thundering in my skull. The rope scraped across jagged rock, and my harness groaned in protest. My flashlight flickered, threatening to fail. More. Now, a final wave of dread closed over me like a shroud, and still I forced one more breath, one more tug on the rope. The darkness below yawned wider, promising an encounter I wasn't sure I could endure, yet I couldn't stop. And is a bordual, honest, if a vexumer, pidere. I continued downward, every nerve alight with terror, clinging to the razor-thin hope that some form of resolution, no matter how grim, waited at the bottom of that bottomless pit. Above me, the sounds of collapsing rock and vengeful shrieks began to fade, replaced by a reverberating silence that felt even more harrowing. The only thing left was the echo of my own heartbeat and the faint glow of the minerals that had guided me here, pulsing like the final beats of a dying star.